Welcome to Modemulator Instructional Video number 7. This video will explain and demonstrate how to upgrade Modemulator to the latest firmware. The topics covered in this video are the requirements and setup for doing a firmware upgrade, how to check the Modemulator's current firmware version, where to get the new firmware, how to load the new firmware into the Modemulator, what to do if the Modemulator remains in boot mode after receiving the new firmware, and how to upgrade the firmware of a remote Modemulator. The firmware upgrade process requires the target Modemulator and a computer that has access to the internet, a web browser, a terminal application that is capable of sending a binary file, such as TerraTerm, and has a standard DB9 serial port. A short serial cable is also required. As an alternative to a serial port and a serial cable, use a USB port and a USB to serial cable. To set up for upgrading a local Modemulator, use the serial cable to connect the computer to the Modemulator's terminal port. Power up the Modemulator and wait approximately 2 minutes for the system state LED to turn green. Then launch the terminal application. Within the terminal application, select the COM port that is associated with the computer's serial port. If necessary, check the computer's operating system to find which COM port is connected to the serial port. And choose the serial settings for communicating with the Modemulator. The upgrade will transfer faster at higher serial speeds. Checking the Modemulator's code revision. Enter AT into the terminal. An OK response confirms communication with the Modemulator. Enter ATI7 and wait for the OK response at the end of the screen. Take note of the current code revision. The new Modemulator firmware may require upgrading the gateway's firmware and application, so also take note of the gateway's current firmware version number and application version number. Getting new firmware. Keep the terminal application open and launch a web browser. Type www.usr.com/support/3520 into the address bar. Select a country or region. Scroll to Downloads. Find a link to the newest firmware. Compare the version number of the newest firmware to the Modemulator's current code revision. If the Modemulator doesn't have the newest firmware, click the firmware link to download the firmware to a convenient location on the computer. The web page also lists the versions of gateway firmware and application required by the new Modemulator firmware. Compare these versions of the gateway firmware and application to the gateway's current image. If the current versions don't match the required versions, upgrade the gateway images before upgrading the Modemulator firmware. For help upgrading the gateway images, watch the Modemulator installation video on YouTube. Loading the new firmware into the Modemulator. Close the web browser and switch to the terminal application. type the AT exclamation command. Answer yes, and the Modemulator will enter boot mode. Note, the next step erases the current Modemulator firmware from the Modemulator's memory. Within 40 seconds, type $% and wait for the load hex file prompt. Now use the terminal to send the new firmware to the Modemulator. And wait for the Modemulator to respond OK. To verify that the new firmware has loaded, enter ATI7 and check the code revision number on the screen. Modemulator will test the checksum of the new firmware. If the checksum fails, the boot prompt will reappear. If the Modemulator remains in boot mode after receiving the new firmware, verify that the terminal application is using a raw binary file transfer. Do not use protocols like Xmodem, Ymodem, Zmodem, Kermit, or others. Or the firmware file may be corrupt. Try downloading the firmware again from the USR support page and repeat the file transfer into the Modemulator. If the Modemulator still remains in boot mode, contact USR technical support. The firmware of a remote Modemulator can be upgraded over the air by using a local Modemulator and a cellular connection to initiate remote command mode. Watch the Modemulator instructional video number 6 on YouTube for help using remote command mode. Once the Modemulators are connected in remote command mode, follow the same steps that are used for a local firmware upgrade as described earlier in this video. Note that transferring the firmware over a cellular connection from a local Modemulator to a remote Modemulator will consume hundreds of kilobytes from the cellular data plans of both Modemulators. When the remote upgrade is complete, the Modemulators will automatically disconnect. In this video, I've shown how to upgrade Modemulator firmware locally or remotely. For more details about any Modemulator commands, see the Command Reference chapter in the Modemulator User Guide, which can be downloaded from these USR support pages. I hope this video was helpful for understanding how to upgrade Modemulator firmware. Thank you for watching, and thank you for choosing USR.